Welcome back to another episode of Litigious, the number one podcast for legal stories in the news, brought to you by DeRazio Peterson, an employment and serious injury law firm in New York. If you have questions, reminder to please reach out to us at Litigious Podcast on Instagram. If you have questions about legal issues, reach out to us at DeRazioPeterson.com or at DeRazio Peterson on Instagram. And as always, if you enjoy the podcast, please share it, like it, subscribe, all the things. Giovanna is here as usual. And today we're talking once again about a ICE shooting and the legal implications. And this arising out of the shooting in Minnesota over the weekend of Alex Preddy. Unless you have been living under a rock, you know exactly what this story is about. Uh, Quick recap. Preddy was filming ICE agents on Saturday morning when the situation exploded. An agent pushed down a woman. Preddy stepped in with his camera. He was pepper sprayed, brought to the ground, and shot several times and killed. And there's a number of interesting ways that we can look at this, but the first thing we wanted to talk about, I think, is are protesters allowed to record? And I've seen all kinds of mixed media on this. Everything from he shouldn't have been out there recording, he shouldn't have been out there with a weapon because he was carrying a concealed weapon, which is legal in Minnesota, to did his phone look like a weapon, which is it was a Newsmax story apparently. I think the answer to that is definitively no. His phone did not look like a weapon and could not have been confused for a weapon. But let's talk first about what the rights of protesters are in general when it comes to recording ICE agents, or essentially anyone. And I think this is interesting because we're at a point in society where no one can seem to agree on what the truth is, while simultaneously everyone is recording everything all the time. And I think in these situations, video recordings have helped to clarify what happened. In some cases, to contradict blatant lies about what happened. And I think it's important. We've also seen ICE agents walking around recording people. Frankly, I think that we should be in a situation where they're wearing body cams. That would seem to me to protect them and protect individuals. But let's talk about recording rights of protesters.
You're allowed to.
Oh,
You have a
okay. Moving
First
on. Yeah.
Amendment right to record them. I don't think that's really up for debate. I mean, there's been a lot of altercations between ICE agents and people recording them that the ICE agents don't like that they're being recorded. But I don't think from a legal perspective, there is much room for debate that you are permitted to record law enforcement or really, and I know that there's people who don't think that these guys should be referred to as law enforcement, at the risk of sort of painting, looping legitimate local law enforcement in the same category as what's been going on here. But you're allowed to record law enforcement and anyone else that's really out in public without their permission. There's certainly parameters on, what you can do with uh, you know, maybe something that was more personal or something like that you recorded of someone, or, ways when it can cross the line into some sort of invasion of privacy and the person is not necessarily in public. But in this situation, yes, this is permitted. You can record people at a protest, you can record law enforcement people engaged in their duties. The only, I think, one of the few caveats to that is there are some laws or some states that have laws against recording the audio of people without their consent. So New York is a one-party consent state. So as long as one party to the conversation agrees, then, so I could record a conversation with you, even if you don't consent because I consent. So there have been cases where maybe the audio from a video is not maybe admissible in court or something like that, but the video visual evidence itself is.
Yeah, I don't think we need to belabor the right. I think it was obvious that he was allowed to do it. I, I look, there's this whole situation in Minnesota has boiled over. It's incredibly unfortunate that it's been allowed to get to this point. Do I think that law enforcement in general should be able to do their jobs without people shoving a camera in their face? Yeah, because most law enforcement officers are good, are doing it for the right reasons, are trying to enforce the law, are not trying to, harm anyone. Um, this situation has spiraled to the point where people in Minnesota clearly believe that there are no good intentions here, and they're trying to, legitimately protest what they believe is a complete overreach, and particularly after the Renee Good situation. Um, that kind of gets to the next point, which is this idea that you see of blaming the victim sort of regardless of how the situation ultimately unfolded. And this happened all over social media. You saw it with Megyn Kelly, who I think said something to the effect of that he should have just stayed home. You saw it with people contradicting years of their position that you should be entitled to carry a gun wherever you want under the Second Amendment, saying that he shouldn't have brought a gun to a protest, which, by the way, is not illegal. And it's something that we see routinely in our practice, which is that whenever someone makes a complaint or tries to hold a large institution accountable, one of the first defenses tends to be, let's figure out a way to blame the person who got hurt. So none of this is really that shocking to me. And I know, Megyn Kelly jumps to mind because she's an alumni of our law school, who has, in my opinion, really fallen all over herself to be as offensive as possible. And I think part of that is because that gets clicks, it gets her attention, and it gets and makes her money. So I'm not surprised in any way that she's saying the things that she's saying. But you want to talk a little bit about the fact that this is not surprising to us.
Yeah, I mean, the bl victim blaming is something that you see sort of in any situation like we handle where you represent a victim, because, I mean, and look, in certain circumstances, there are recognized legal principles about did you contribute to what happened to
Yeah,
you, but that has to do with, in the moment, what are you doing that is contributing to the situation? It doesn't have to do with should you have been physically present in the first place. You could apply that to literally anything. Well, if you hadn't left the house today, you wouldn't have gotten hit by a car. Or if so I think that's kind of a lazy um argument to say you never should have been there. And that's basically what, from what I saw, most more influencer type of people on that side of things kind of had a party line that was sort of like, it's so easy not to get shot by ICE. Like, you just stay home and take care of your children and whatever. And it's like, what are you talking about? Like, that that doesn't make any sense. You know what I mean? Megyn Kelly herself is partially famous for holding Roger Ailes accountable for sexual harassment, as
yep,
she should have and as he should have been. But I'm sure she would not have appreciated it if someone had said, well, Megyn, if you had just stayed home and taken care of your husband and your children and not gone into the workplace, then nobody would have sexually harassed you.
yeah.
Like, I don't like that argument. You have a First Amendment right to go out and protest. People, and by the way, though, I think we should also clarify that Alex Preddy was not killed during those big protests that they had the day before. He was sort of observing some, in this situation, it was actually border patrol activity that was going on in a neighborhood, and he's just kind of standing to the side and videoing it. And when we're talking about your right to video, that's what he was doing. He wasn't obstructing them. He wasn't, you're not allowed to obstruct them. You're not allowed to, if your definition of videoing someone is to bodily put yourself in their way and shove a phone in their face, then I think you're going to have a different issue. Do I think you deserve to be executed for that? No. Maybe they could arrest you then, and then you're held accountable for whatever you did that was wrong. But he wasn't, obstructing anyway. But, people on all sides of the political spectrum protest, people protested COVID requirements. People have gun pro-gun Second Amendment rallies. They try to say January 6th was a protest. Like, so you can't just say First Amendment for me, but not for thee, Second Amendment for me, but not for thee, which is basically what happened or what is happening, in this situation for anyone who still feels the need to make excuses for this situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's starting to shake out a little bit like I thought it might, which is that I think I don't agree with the Renee Good situation either, but I think there's a better argument for whatever action they took. Again, I don't think it's the correct argument, but I think it's a stronger one potentially legally. This is sort of an indefensible situation for this shooting, and I think that they're recognizing that. Whether they're recognizing it for the right reason or not, it doesn't really matter. But the officers have been placed on leave. It seems like there's going to be an investigation, but this then falls to a topic that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, which is there actually any liability civilly or criminally for the actions of these ICE agents for what I would say is very likely the wrongful death of Alex Preddy. And we talked in the past about, if this case happened in New York with, state police or someone like that, this would be a massive wrongful death lawsuit. And we talked about the Bivens case, but you want to kind of talk about it a little bit more in terms of this context?
Yeah, I do want to just briefly go back for 1 second to the victim blaming because I think it's fair to acknowledge that if he had been anyone else, I don't know if the tide would have turned because he is the perfect victim. He is a white man exercising his Second Amendment rights who works at the VA taking care of veterans. He is the perfect victim. I feel slightly troubled because had he been anyone else, I think they would have found a way to excuse this. Because, like you said, with Renee Good, you saw a lot more sort of room for interpretation and you saw a lot more vilification of her. Not only, I mean, with him as well, they immediately tried to call him a domestic terrorist or something, but they had to back off of that pretty quickly. Renee Good continued to receive a character assassination because she's a lesbian, because her wife was yelling, because she wasn't as attractive as we might like women to be, and a lot of other stuff that kind of allowed people to put her in this category of, well, that would never happen to me. But this man felt, I think, probably feels very familiar to a lot of people and to a lot of men. And it's the first time that you saw people coming out. And, I'll take the win if it took like the gun to be the thing to make people be like, this is the last straw. But that is not, irrelevant. And, so it's hard. Like we see this in our practice. Like you often do not have a perfect victim, and in the type of work that we do, people's medical records are fair game, their mental health history is fair game, and people use it against you. I've had people get like their character assassinated for mental health conditions, for reproductive issues, and so
Criminal convictions, yeah.
yeah, but okay, I'm sorry. I just had to like, I feel like you have to acknowledge that things may not have changed if it wasn't this particular person.
No, but look, you're right, but I also think that whatever, if this were going to happen, and this is the catalyst for a recognition that what's going on here is crazy and completely inappropriate, then that's a good thing, and not that this is in any way, shape, or form a good thing, but if this is what ultimately allowed people to coalesce around it to the point that maybe there will be some change, that's what we need. So, I
I
don't
mean,
want
I
to I don't want
agree.
to beat it, but all right. So talk about Bivens and whether there's any liability here.
Yeah, so just quickly, we talked about this in the last episode, and what we're talking about suing federal officers for violating your constitutional rights. State officers, we use the statute 1983. We don't have that under federal law, so we have to fall within a Supreme Court decision called Bivens that was decided in the Fourth Amendment context, which protects you from, excessive use of force. But the case has been very narrowly construed over the years. And in 2022, the Supreme Court held that Bivens did not apply to create a cause of action against Border Patrol agents for violating the Fourth Amendment. And another thing that's significant in that case that could apply here is that they also held in that case that Bivens does not apply to the First Amendment, freedom of speech. So at this point, we don't have a civil remedy to sue any federal officials for a First Amendment violation or potentially Border Patrol in general for a Fourth Amendment violation. Um, there are some differences between this case and the 2022 case, which is called Egbert, which is that case was actually at the border, which you can kind of understand would implicate these national security issues, potentially in a different situation here, because not only are we not at the actual border, but we're not dealing with someone who is potentially breaking the immigration law. We're dealing with a totally separate kind of American citizen exercising their First Amendment rights. There's a difference between like a protester standing there and then the people who are actually the subject of the immigration enforcement or the Border Patrol thing. That being said, there's plenty of like Google search kind of law article type of things that just say the holding of this case is that you cannot sue Border Patrol agent under Bivens. So that's who these people were. Um, I did some Westlaw looking into cases that have cited Egbert. They have applied it to ICE as well at traffic stops. So I think right now there's probably pretty strong argument that there's no civil recourse against these people under, for the constitutional violations.
There seems to be a groundswell of some support right now for legislation to allow for this. I know California is working on getting some legislation passed, which would allow liability, but that goes back to the supremacy issue that we talked about previously. So I don't know if states start passing laws that allow liability for federal agents acting within the state. I think that's probably a little tricky and that might raise some constitutional issues. You need
Yeah,
what you
there's
need what you need is federal legislation providing a right of action. I don't think with the current administration that's going to happen. Even if it were to pass the House and Senate, which currently it probably wouldn't. But even if there's a change in majority at in the midterms, I still don't know that that would happen. But it's something that people should be thinking about because um, it is important and it just puts it in line with every other, officer of the law in the United States. And it's not creating anything more cumbersome, but it just holds people accountable. So that would be my hope.
Yeah, and so just as an aside, there is a bill that is pending that was introduced in the Senate called the Accountability for Federal Law Enforcement Act, and the purpose of which would be to amend 1983 to just apply to the federal government like it applies to the states right now. And I mean, you touched on this, why we kind of need this, and we not only I think we should probably acknowledge like what's the reason to have this sort of civil remedy? And we kind of touch on that. I think we touched on it last time about when we were talking about wrongful death lawsuits. And in New York, you can't get emotional distress damages. So the cases, if it's a child or if it's a disabled person, they're not worth as much. And I think you had raised the fact of sometimes people push back on that because they say, well, money is not going to make you whole in that type of situation or whatever. But I think for us who practice civil law, obviously we wouldn't do that if we didn't think it had some value. And a statute like this could come in to give you some type of justice if the criminal justice system doesn't work, you know? So what if they end up not prosecuting the people who did this to him, you know, so you don't have like people being held criminally accountable. One of the things that doesn't sit well with me when you read the Bivens line of cases is when they talk about, you know, do we need a judicial remedy for this? They say, well, we already have, like Border Patrol and ICE already have internal procedures to discipline their officers. But that doesn't necessarily mean anything. I mean, if you have an administration who is doubling down on them being able to do whatever they want, do you really think that they're doing an internal, like a meaningful internal investigation of what these men did? And then what, even if they found out that they did something wrong, take a meaningful action against them? I mean, it took them several days to even put them on leave, and they're being paid.
Yeah, I think that's a similar argument to you saying that lawsuits wouldn't be necessary because the free market would correct itself and that companies would self-regulate and do the right thing. Tobacco companies are a prime example, or one of the original examples of deciding, having internal research that said that your product is harmful and deciding that it doesn't matter, you're going to ignore it. We may talk about today, but if not, we'll talk about it later in the next episode, the current trials against, or the cases that are going to trial against social media companies, based upon allegedly clear knowledge internally that their apps were addictive and harmful to children, and still deciding to go ahead with the components of their apps that were harmful and addictive, despite knowing that they were harmful and addictive, because it kept people engaged. So I think the idea of self-regulation is a joke. I think it ignores the reality of people in business and people in government and people in power. So I think that's a terrible argument. I think allowing a basic civil lawsuit like every other wrongdoer is the way to hold people accountable and the way to affect change. So I feel pretty strongly about that. I think, again, I'm not optimistic that this is happening anytime soon. I'm sure, it's great that it's there, it's been proposed, but I don't see it making its way through. But we can revisit it if it gets anywhere. I do want to talk about the social media cases. I don't think we're going to have time today, so we'll talk about it maybe next week. But speaking of social media, one thing we do want to talk about was there's you're sort of seeing both sides of this situation, in terms of social media influencers speaking up or not speaking up about what's been happening, and you are seeing some, but you're not seeing a lot of people. And the question is why, or why not? And there's a couple of schools of thought on it. One of which is, if this is not your area of expertise or influence, are you really adding anything to the conversation? The other side of that is, well, if you have the platform, you should be speaking up when you see things that are wrong, and when, particularly at the level that we've seen, because this is somewhat unprecedented. Um, the thing that people aren't thinking about that you raised, you brought up to me, is that there may be like real legitimate reasons financially why people aren't speaking out, and including things like clauses in brand deals and contracts. So why don't we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so we've talked about a lot in the past in the more of an traditional employment relationship context, that a lot of companies have social media policies where if you say something, you know, super offensive on social media, whatever, you can get fired. We saw that happening to a lot of people after Charlie Kirk was shot. And we tend to come out on the side of, I think you and I, as employment lawyers, don't think it's great for people to be getting fired constantly because we think it's typically better for society for people to be employed. But from a legal perspective, usually it's okay to do that. This is a slightly different but similar context where these social media influencers and potentially just kind of celebrities in general who might have brand deals sign what we often would potentially refer to as like a morality clause where and those are broader than maybe I think typically you would think of a morality clause as like they can fire you if you the first thing that is popping into my mind right now is that Jared, the Subway guy who like turned out to be some sort of child sex trafficker or something disgusting like that. So usually it's something like that. You are doing drugs, you get arrested, you do something disgusting, like they can fire you. But they are pretty used pretty broadly as well to cover like making political statements and things like that. So I do think that there are probably some people out there who would like to be a little bit more vocal and are not permitted to. And so there are certainly um enforceable, just kind of from a legal perspective, things that you can put into a contract to kind of prevent someone from doing that. And then I suppose it's up to the person, if they are truly, if that's the way they're truly earning their living, if it's worth their while to them to kind of silence themselves.
Yeah, and it goes to something we talked about before, which is, I, look, I kind of understand it. If you're, you know, uh, Apple or Meta or one of these companies that hasn't taken positions on these issues, right? And you're paying a brand sponsor, that's probably not a great example, but you're paying someone who's an influencer to promote your brand. It would make sense to me that you would have some parameters about around which the things that they say because you're not paying them to take those positions and for better or worse, that's your right. So I understand it, and it I give credit to the people who have the financial ability to speak up and actually do, because you see plenty of people who are certainly economically secure and companies, and they're just, they're content to just kind of let things go by. I know not everyone agrees with me on that. I think people certainly have the opinion that if you're not in this world, stay out of it. Everybody can form their own opinions, but I think there are certain times when it's a little bit more important to speak up on these issues. So
Yeah, and look, I don't like, performative stuff. Um, Remember when, the Black Lives Matter stuff was really had blown up at the time during 2020 and there was like we're all going to post like a black square on Instagram. And I'm not saying that to offend anyone who did that. We probably did, but I think I have a recollection of like it wasn't just a black square, it had like resources written out on it. I I personally am not of the mind of, you have to do something performative if it doesn't feel true to yourself and you're just doing it because everybody told you that you should or whatever. And
yeah,
I try not to read malevolence or complicity into people not saying anything because, not everyone uses their social media platform for any reason other than to post a picture of their kids every once in a while or post, resources in your own community or whatever. So I get that. Not it's not going to feel authentic to every single person to chime in on things. But I think in this sort of influencer context or celebrity context where they do speak out on some things, that can start to, your silence can start to feel uncomfortable, I think, to people.
yeah. Well, I've seen more people speak out about this than I have about anything in a long time. So, and more people that I think probably do have something to lose. So that's somewhat encouraging. All right, we're running short on time. I know you wanted to talk about this Matt Khalil football player, former. lawsuit with his ex relating to the size of his manhood, as you've described it. And I'm just going to leave it there.
All right, I know this is your favorite topic. Um,
Well, it's a legal issue, so it's
it is a
fine.
legal
But
issue.
talk about the lawsuit.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, just a little backstory, just a refresher on what happened here. Um, this, I guess she's a model, Haley Khalil, went on a podcast and discussed the size of her ex-husband's manhood in the sense of it being quite large. So I just want to say as an aside, we had a TikTok video about this that got like a ton of traction that we had to turn the comments off from because you can imagine that maybe they started to become a little inappropriate. But most of the comments were coming from perhaps this was like a little bit of a what's the word, insecurity being revealed because a lot of people thought that I was referring to it being tiny, but it was in fact the opposite. So anyway, so I actually read the transcript of what she said, and I'm not going to say it out loud because my mom and kids would be embarrassed, but it was very graphic what she went into, and she like gave a lot of really embarrassing, intimate information about his anatomy and how it impacted their marriage and their intimate relationship. So he sued her for this. Um, she has now moved to dismiss his lawsuit based upon freedom of speech grounds.
Okay.
So
That's interesting.
there's a couple legal issues to kind of unpack with that. So do you want to say something first?
What's the allegation? Who is violating he can't violate her First Amendment rights. Is he claiming that he's using the legal system to impeach or to impede her First Amendment rights?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's like when you raise the first, when a private entity raises the First Amendment in a defamation case, like,
Right.
you're protected, the First Amendment protects your speech unless it's defamation,
Yeah.
in a lot of circumstances. So I think that's her argument here. Um,
Okay.
it turns out, so this case is venued in Minnesota,
Hmm.
most newsworthy state in the country, apparently.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so Minnesota has, and we talked about this the last time, that New York does not have this. Minnesota does recognize a tort, so that's like in our profession is like a almost like a negligence claim or a claim of what did you do wrong, of invasion of privacy that includes the publication of an intimate, private matter.
Hmm. Okay.
Um, so the test is, would it be highly offensive to a reasonable person? And is there a legitimate interest or concern to the public?
Second
So
part might be a little harder.
from his perspective, this was their private, intimate life. It would be highly offensive, I think, to a reasonable person to have this discussed in such great detail. And then, the public concern issue, I think, is where you get kind of the First Amendment stuff that comes in because typically people are allowed to speak about matters of public concern without, the government or whatever infringing on it. But I think in this situation, that's kind of what the ex-wife is her attorney in his statements is kind of saying, if you're a public figure, these are issues of public concern. I think that is, I could see a judge not buying that argument.
Yeah. I mean, that seems like a stretch, but okay.
Yeah, so that's and one another thing that I thought was a potential issue. So I mean, just to kind of conclude that little piece of it, it looks like under the law of the state of Minnesota, this seems like the type of case that could continue, whereas maybe in a different state you would not be able to do that. But I also was reading about her attorney's statements about it, and it kind of reminded me of those cases that we had talked about, like the Tony Busby, where your lawyer's statements for the press can potentially get even then the lawyer in trouble. And I think that when the ex-wife spoke about this after she was sued, she took a little bit of a more like conciliatory tone of, this guy was a great guy. Like I loved him. I have nothing bad to say about him. Like this was just a tiny little piece of the interview, and the rest of the interview I was talking about how great he is and all this stuff, and didn't really make it seem like she was accusing him of anything terrible or whatever. But when the lawyer talked about it, he described it as a sexual trauma, and I thought that that was a little bit dicey because I think sometimes lawyers can get themselves in trouble when, we all know that when you have a filing a complaint or writing a brief, you're painting a picture and you're telling a story and you're kind of framing it in a certain context. But when you're out there talking to like a news, talking to the press or whatever, sometimes that can pull you outside of a litigation context where maybe what you say actually could be something that you could get sued for defamation for. And I think that sort of framing this in those terms is a little bit dicey because now
Right.
you're kind of taking it like to the next level.
Yeah.
Most lay people and most people out in the world, when you say the word sexual trauma, are thinking that something happened to you without your consent. And
Yeah.
that's not what she was talking about.
Yeah.
So
And
I'll
it
be
seems like
curious to see, because sometimes these things like then they snowball out of control. Like we had said, I think the last podcast, like did he really need to sue her? He probably put like a giant spotlight on this issue that nobody really even cared about or even listened to this podcast. So now it's going to be continually in the news as things happen. It blew up again when she makes this motion to dismiss, and now it snowballs even more when the lawyer comes out and uses hyperbole. So I don't know.
yeah, again, it's a
I
classic.
simultaneously think he has a good lawsuit and thinks that he probably shouldn't have done it in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, with this news cycle, that story was gone. If anyone even picked up on this story, it was gone within a day. That's it. It's over. Now it's lingering. People are, it's in the news, it's wherever. So be careful what you wish for. We say that all the time. I said it last week, say it again. We do have to wrap. Anything else before we wrap?
Nope.
All right. Thanks for listening. We'll be back again next week. I do want to talk about the social media trials because I think it's interesting and important for any of us who are parents. So tune back in. Again, if you like this podcast, share it, like it, subscribe. And if you have questions, hit us up at Litigious Podcast. Thanks again for listening. See you soon.